Sometimes the deepest wounds lead us to the greatest treasures. When 13-year-old Maya lost both parents in a car accident, she found solace only in the company of her faithful dog, Scout, and the quiet darkness of an abandoned cave near her grandmother's Tennessee home. Everyone in town called it the worthless cave, just another empty hole in the limestone hills. But Maya didn't care about its reputation. She needed somewhere to hide from the whispers, the pitying looks, and the weight of her grief. Day after day, she and Scout would disappear into its cool shadows, finding peace in the silence. Then one afternoon, Scout began digging frantically at what seemed like solid rock. But what would they discover behind that hidden wall that would change everything they thought they knew about Maya's family history? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The old farmhouse sat like a weathered sentinel on the rolling hills of rural Tennessee, its white paint peeling in long strips that caught the morning light. Maya Morrison pressed her face against the cool glass of her bedroom window, watching Scout nose around the chicken coop with his usual morning enthusiasm. The German Shepherd mix had been her constant companion for the past 6 months, ever since she'd come to live with her grandmother after the accident. Nana Ruth moved through the kitchen below with the same measured pace she'd maintained for 73 years, her movements deliberate and economical. Maya could hear the familiar sounds, the whistle of the kettle, the scrape of the cast-iron skillet against the burner, the soft murmur of morning prayers. These sounds had become the rhythm of Maya's new life, replacing the urban chaos of Memphis, where she'd lived with her parents. The transition hadn't been easy. Everything about this place felt foreign at first. The way sound traveled differently across open spaces, how darkness truly meant darkness without streetlights, the way people moved slower and spoke with more consideration. But gradually, the quiet had become a refuge rather than an emptiness. Maya pulled on her worn jeans and the oversized flannel shirt that had belonged to her grandfather, dead now 10 years, but still present in the scent of tobacco and old spice that clung to the fabric. Nana Ruth had offered it without explanation one particularly difficult morning, and Maya had worn it almost daily since. It felt like armor against the world's sympathetic glances. Downstairs, her grandmother stood at the stove, silver hair pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn since Maya could remember. Ruth Morrison was a small woman, but she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd weathered many storms. Her hands, lined and capable, moved with the confidence of decades spent cooking, mending, and managing a household. "Morning, baby girl," Ruth said without turning around, somehow always knowing when Maya entered a room. "Breakfast is almost ready." Maya slid into her usual chair at the scarred oak table, running her fingers along the wood grain. This table had been in the Morrison family for generations, bearing the marks of countless meals, homework sessions, and family discussions. Sometimes Maya could almost hear the echoes of all those conversations, all those lives that had gathered around this same piece of furniture. "I was thinking of taking Scout up to the hills today," Maya said, accepting the plate of eggs and biscuits her grandmother set before her. "If that's all right." Ruth's expression didn't change, but Maya caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "You be careful up there, here. Some of those old limestone caves can be tricky. And don't go wandering too far." It was the same gentle warning she gave every time, delivered with the same maternal concern. Maya nodded, though they both knew she'd been exploring those hills almost daily since arriving. The caves, particularly the one everyone called Worthless, had become her sanctuary. The town of Cedar Hollow had opinions about most things, and the abandoned cave was no exception. Maya had heard the stories, how it had been explored decades ago by hopeful treasure hunters and amateur geologists, only to yield nothing but empty chambers and disappointed dreams. Local wisdom held that it was just another of the many limestone formations that dotted the Tennessee landscape, remarkable only for being unremarkable. But Maya didn't care about local wisdom. She cared about the way the cave embraced her with its cool, constant temperature. The way sound was muffled inside, creating a cocoon of silence that felt safer than anywhere else. Most importantly, it was where she could think about her parents without well-meaning adults trying to help her process her grief. Scout finished his breakfast and padded over to rest his large head on Maya's knee, brown eyes looking up with the devotion only dogs can manage. He'd appeared at the farmhouse 3 weeks after Maya's arrival, thin and obviously abandoned, and had simply stayed. No amount of newspaper ads or calls to local shelters had turned up an owner. Ruth had proclaimed it God's will and set about spoiling the animal with table scraps and belly rubs. "That dog's got good instincts," Ruth often said, and Maya was beginning to understand what she meant. Scout seemed to sense her moods before she did, appearing at her side during the worst moments and somehow knowing when she needed space. He never judged her tears or her anger, never offered useless platitudes about everything happening for a reason. After breakfast, Maya helped with the morning chores, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, checking the small vegetable garden that Ruth maintained with stubborn pride. The physical work felt good, grounding her in the present moment when her mind wanted to drift to darker places. The walk to the cave took 20 minutes across fields that belonged to various neighbors, all of whom had known Maya's family for generations. The Morrisons had been in Cedar Hollow since before the Civil War, though the details of that history remained frustratingly vague. Whenever Maya asked direct questions about their ancestors, Ruth's answers became evasive, filled with phrases like, "That was a long time ago," and "Some stories are better left buried." The cave entrance sat in a natural depression between 2 limestone outcroppings, partially hidden by scrub oak and wild honeysuckle. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a shadow in the rock face. Maya had discovered it during her second week in Cedar Hollow, following a deer path that seemed to lead nowhere. Scout had been nervous that first day, whining and pacing at the cave mouth while Maya explored with a flashlight borrowed from her grandmother's kitchen drawer. But over time, he'd grown comfortable with their routine, often leading the way down the familiar path. The main chamber was larger than it appeared from outside, roughly the size of Ruth's living room, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. The floor was covered with decades of accumulated leaves and debris, and the walls bore the scratches and initials of previous visitors. Most people, Maya had realized, came once out of curiosity and never returned. But Maya returned daily, bringing homework, books, or sometimes just her thoughts. She'd created a comfortable spot near the back wall, where a natural shelf in the rock provided a backrest. It was here that she'd found the leather journal. The discovery had happened by accident during her 3rd week of cave visits. Scout had been investigating something near the rear wall when Maya heard him pawing it loose. Rocks. Thinking he'd cornered some small animal, she'd gone to investigate and found him digging at what appeared to be a deliberate pile of stones. The journal had been wrapped in oiled cloth and tucked into a natural crevice behind the stones, as if someone had been very careful to protect it from moisture and time. The leather cover was worn smooth, and the pages were yellowed but remarkably well preserved. Most of the entries were illegible, faded beyond recognition, but occasionally Maya could make out words or partial phrases. Names appeared frequently: Sarah, Elijah, Freedom, Jordan. There were what looked like crude maps, sketches of landmarks, and notations that might have been dates. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, suggesting education and purpose rather than casual journaling. Maya had shown the journal to Ruth, hoping for insight into its origins or significance. Her grandmother had examined it carefully, running weathered fingers over the pages with an expression Maya couldn't quite read. "Could be anyone's," Ruth had said finally, though her tone suggested otherwise. "These old caves have been hiding places for all sorts of folks over the years. Might be someone's old hunting notes, or maybe from those treasure hunters who used to poke around. But Maya sensed there was more to the story. The way Ruth had held the journal, the careful attention she'd paid to certain pages, the slight tremor in her voice, it all suggested recognition. When Maya pressed for more information, Ruth had changed the subject with the skill of someone practiced in deflection. The journal now resided in Maya's bedroom, tucked safely in her dresser drawer. She'd read through it countless times, trying to decipher the faded text and understand the purpose behind its creation. The maps were particularly intriguing, showing landmarks she couldn't identify and paths that seemed to follow no logic she could understand. Cedar Hollow itself offered few clues. The town library was small but well-maintained, run by Mrs. Henderson, a friendly woman who'd known Ruth since childhood. Maya had spent hours there researching local history, but the official records seemed sanitized, focusing on agricultural development and railroad expansion while glossing over the more complex aspects of the region's past. Dr. Reeves, the local historian who occasionally gave talks at the library, proved more interesting. A retired college professor who'd moved to Cedar Hollow to research southern migration patterns. He possessed an enthusiasm for local history that bordered on obsession. When Maya had casually mentioned finding old papers in family storage, he'd immediately offered to examine them. Something had held Maya back from accepting his offer. Perhaps it was Ruth's obvious discomfort whenever Dr. Reeves was mentioned, or maybe it was some instinct that suggested family secrets should remain family secrets, at least until she better understood what those secrets might be. The days had fallen into a comfortable pattern. Morning chores, afternoon cave visits with Scout, evening meals with Ruth, while the older woman shared stories from Maya's childhood or memories of Maya's parents. These conversations were precious, helping Maya maintain connection to the people she'd lost while building new connections to the place that was becoming home. But underneath this growing comfort lay questions that wouldn't quiet. The journal represented something significant, Maya was certain. The careful way it had been hidden, the detailed maps and notations, the fact that Ruth clearly recognized something about it. These weren't coincidences. Scout had developed his own relationship with the cave, often investigating areas Maya hadn't fully explored. His behavior suggested the presence of things she couldn't see or smell, and his instincts had proven reliable enough that she'd learned to pay attention when he seemed particularly interested in something. As autumn deepened and the Tennessee hills blazed with color, Maya felt herself settling into this new life. The sharp edges of her grief had softened, not disappearing, but becoming more manageable. The cave remained her refuge, but increasingly it felt like a place of mystery rather than just escape. Standing now at her bedroom window, watching Scout patrol the yard with cheerful determination, Maya made a decision. Today would be different. Today she would follow Scout's instincts more carefully, pay closer attention to what he seemed to sense in the cave's depths. The journal lay in her dresser drawer, its secrets still largely intact. But Maya was beginning to understand that some secrets were meant to be uncovered, especially when they belonged to your own family. The question wasn't whether she should investigate further. It was whether she was ready for what she might find. Ruth's voice drifted up from the kitchen, calling Maya to breakfast with the same gentle authority that had anchored countless Morrison mornings. But today, Maya sensed, would mark the beginning of something new. The cave held answers, and she was finally ready to seek them out. Scout barked once from the yard below, as if he too understood that change was coming. Maya smiled for the first time in weeks, feeling something that had been dormant stirring back to life. Purpose, perhaps. Or maybe just curiosity, strong enough to overcome caution. Either way, it felt like progress. The October afternoon carried the kind of crisp clarity that made Maya's chest ache with unnamed longing. She and Scout made their way along the familiar, a path to the cave, dead leaves crunching beneath their feet and releasing the earthy scent of decay that always reminded Maya of renewal rather than ending. Her grandmother's words from that morning echoed in her mind. Some secrets have their own timing, baby girl. They reveal themselves when we're ready to understand. Ruth had been unusually reflective over breakfast, studying Maya with those sharp eyes that seemed to see through pretense. When Maya had mentioned her plans to spend extra time at the cave, her grandmother had simply nodded and pressed a thermos of hot chocolate into her hands, along with her usual warning about being careful. Scout trotted ahead with more energy than usual, occasionally looking back to ensure Maya was following. His behavior had been different all morning, restless, alert, as if he sensed something important was about to happen. Maya had learned to trust these instincts over their months together. The dog possessed an awareness that extended beyond normal canine senses. The cave entrance welcomed them with its familiar coolness. Maya settled into her usual spot against the back wall, while Scout began his typical exploration of the perimeter. But instead of his usual casual investigation, he went directly to the rear corner, where loose stones had always formed an irregular pile. Maya had noticed this spot before, but had assumed it was nothing more than natural cave formation, rocks that had fallen from the ceiling over decades or centuries. Scout, however, seemed convinced otherwise. He pawed at the stones with increasing intensity, whining softly when they didn't move easily. "What is it, boy?" Maya called, not immediately concerned. Scout often found interesting scents or small creatures in various corners of the cave, but when she looked up from her homework, she saw something that made her heart skip. Scout had managed to dislodge several of the larger stones, revealing what appeared to be a deliberate arrangement rather than random collapse. The rocks had been carefully placed, fitted together like puzzle pieces. Maya scrambled to her feet, her algebra forgotten. "Scout, wait, let me see." The dog stepped back obediently, his tail wagging with excitement. Maya knelt beside the disturbed stones, running her hands over the surfaces. Her fingers traced the edges, feeling for the intentional gaps Scout had discovered. What she found made her breath catch. The stones weren't random at all. They formed a carefully constructed wall, designed to appear natural, while completely concealing whatever lay behind. And Scout's digging had revealed a gap, not large, but big enough to suggest significant space beyond. "Good boy," Maya whispered, her voice tight with growing excitement. "Very good boy." She began removing stones more systematically, working carefully to avoid causing any collapse. Each rock she moved revealed more of the hidden opening, and with each revelation, her certainty grew that this was no accident of geology. The opening, when fully cleared, was roughly 2 feet square, small enough to discourage casual investigation, large enough for someone determined to pass through. Maya played her flashlight beam into the darkness beyond and gasped. The hidden chamber was larger than the main cave, its ceiling stretching beyond the reach of her light. But what made Maya's hands shake was what the beam revealed scattered. Across the floor, artifacts, dozens of them, arranged with obvious care and protected from moisture by their concealed location. Maya's mind raced through possibilities. Had the cave been someone's hiding place? Were these things valuable enough to warrant such elaborate concealment? And why had Scout been drawn to this particular spot with such certainty? She squeezed through the opening, Scout following with eager anticipation. The hidden chamber felt different from the main cave, less like a natural formation and more like a room someone had inhabited. The walls bore tool marks where they'd been smoothed and shaped. Stone shelves had been carved at regular intervals, each holding carefully arranged objects. Maya's flashlight beam danced across the artifacts as she tried to process what she was seeing. There were tools, some she recognized, others completely foreign. Books wrapped in oiled cloth similar to what had protected the journal. Metal, objects that might have been navigation instruments. And clothing, simple practical garments that spoke of hard work and careful preservation. But it was the locket that stopped Maya in her tracks. It lay on a central shelf, as if placed there. with special reverence, its tarnished silver surface catching the flashlight beam and throwing it back in scattered fragments. Maya approached carefully, aware that she was looking at something precious to whoever had hidden these things. The locket was heart-shaped, roughly the size of her palm, and suspended from a chain that had once been beautiful, but now showed the green patina of age. Delicate engravings covered the surface, flowers, vines, and symbols Maya didn't recognize, but that filled her with strange familiarity. Her hands trembled as she lifted the locket, surprised by its weight. The chain links were solid, substantial, suggesting this had been an expensive piece in its time. Maya examined the clasp mechanism, finding it still functional despite its age. The locket opened with a soft click, revealing two compartments. In one side was a photograph, a tintype portrait of a young black woman with Maya's own eyes and the Morrison family's distinctive jawline. The woman wore a simple dress and serious expression, but her gaze held intelligence and determination that transcended the formal constraints of 19th-century photography. The other compartment contained a folded piece of paper, so delicate. Maya was afraid to unfold it, but when she did, her breath caught. Written in careful script were the words, "Sarah Morrison, Freedom, 1863, for my granddaughter's granddaughter, that she might know from where she comes." Maya sank to the ground, the locket cradled in her palms like a prayer. Sarah Morrison, the name from the journal, now connected to a face, a date, and a message that seemed to reach across generations directly to Maya herself. Scout settled beside her, pressing his warm body against her side, as if sensing the magnitude of this moment. Maya stared at the photograph, seeing her own features reflected in this ancestor she'd never known existed. The woman in the picture had Maya's stubborn chin, her wide-set eyes, even the way one eyebrow lifted slightly higher than the other. But more than physical resemblance, Maya sensed a connection that went deeper than blood. This woman had lived through times Maya could only imagine, had faced challenges that required the kind of courage Maya wasn't sure she possessed. Yet here was evidence that Sarah Morrison had not just survived, but had thought about the future, about descendants she would never meet but whose lives she hoped to touch. The chamber around Maya seemed to hum with presence, as if all the careful preservation had been leading to this moment of recognition. She understood now why Scout had been drawn to this place, why the journal had felt so significant, why Ruth's evasions about family history had carried such weight. Maya's fingers traced the engravings on the locket's surface, finding comfort in the physical connection to her ancestor. The symbols she'd thought unfamiliar began to make sense. They were patterns she'd seen in Ruth's quilts, in the ironwork around the farmhouse, in the way her grandmother arranged flowers. Family markers passed down through generations, their meaning preserved even when their origins were forgotten. The other artifacts in the chamber suddenly took on new significance. These weren't random treasures hidden by unknown people. They were family heirlooms, carefully preserved by someone who understood their value extended far beyond monetary worth. Sarah Morrison had created this place not just as hiding spot, but as a legacy vault for the descendants she might never know. Maya carefully returned the locket to its place on the shelf, but not before memorizing every detail of the photograph and message. She would need time to process this discovery, to understand what it meant for her understanding of herself and her family. Scout had begun investigating other areas of the chamber, his tail wagging with the satisfaction of a job. "Well done." Maya followed his lead, playing her flashlight over the other artifacts, but not disturbing them. There would be time for closer examination, but right now she felt overwhelmed by the implications of what they'd found. The hidden chamber represented more than historical artifacts. It was proof of intentional preservation, of someone caring enough about the future to ensure important things wouldn't be lost. Sarah Morrison had looked forward across generations, imagining great-great-granddaughters who might need to understand where they came from. As Maya made her way back through the concealed entrance, She felt fundamentally changed. The cave was no longer just her refuge from grief. It was a connection to ancestors who had faced their own griefs and somehow found ways to preserve hope for the future. Scout followed her out, but his attention remained focused on the chamber behind them. Maya understood. They had crossed a threshold today, discovered something that would change everything they thought they knew about their family and their place in Cedar Hollow's history. The walk back to the farmhouse passed in contemplative silence. Maya's mind churned with questions about Sarah Morrison, about what Freedom 1863 might mean, about why Ruth had never mentioned this remarkable ancestor. But underneath the questions was a growing sense of purpose, a feeling that she'd been led to this discovery for reasons that extended beyond coincidence. Ruth was waiting on the front porch when Maya and Scout emerged from the tree line, her expression knowing in a way that suggested she'd been expecting this moment. Maya approached slowly, the weight of discovery heavy in her chest. "Find what you were looking for?" Ruth asked quietly. Maya met her grandmother's eyes, seeing generations of Morrison women reflected there. "I found Sarah's locket." Ruth's sharp intake of breath confirmed what Maya had begun to suspect. Her grandmother had known about the chamber all along, had been waiting for Maya to discover it on her own. "Then, I suppose," Ruth said finally, "it's time we talked." The conversation with Ruth had lasted well into the evening, filled with careful revelations and decades of protected silence finally breaking open. Maya learned that Sarah Morrison hadn't just been an ancestor. She'd been a conductor on the Underground Railroad, using the cave system to hide and guide freedom seekers through Tennessee. The locket was only the beginning. Now, 3 days later, Maya returned to the chamber with a sense of mission rather than mere curiosity. Ruth had given her permission to explore fully, with the understanding that some family secrets were meant to be preserved, not exposed to the wider world's judgment. Scout led the way as always, his behavior suggesting he understood the gravity of their task. Maya carried a notebook, her grandfather's old camera, and a small bag of supplies Ruth had prepared. Things like cotton gloves, clean cloths, and a magnifying glass that had belonged to Maya's great-grandfather. The hidden chamber felt different, now that Maya understood its purpose. What had seemed like random preservation now revealed itself as careful curation. Someone, Sarah Morrison herself, or perhaps those who came after, had organized these artifacts with the precision of a museum curator. Maya began at the shelf where she'd found the locket, working systematically to document each item before examining it closely. The notebook filled quickly with sketches and descriptions. Brass button with eagle design, possibly military, small leather pouch containing seeds, purpose unknown, wooden carving of bird in flight, symbol, but it was the map that made Maya's hands shake with excitement. She found it rolled carefully in a metal tube that had protected it from moisture and age. The parchment was thick and sturdy, clearly made to last, and the ink had faded to brown but remained legible. As Maya spread it across the chamber floor, weighting the corners with smooth stones, she realized she was looking at something extraordinary. The map showed the cave system in detail that spoke of intimate knowledge. Not just the main chamber Maya knew, but tunnels and passages extending in all directions. Dotted lines marked safe routes, while solid lines indicated dangerous passages. Symbols appeared at regular intervals. Some Maya recognized from the locket's engravings, others completely foreign. Most remarkably, the map showed connections to other caves throughout the region. Lines traced underground pathways that linked multiple hiding places, creating a network Maya hadn't imagined possible. Near the bottom of the map, in careful script, someone had written, "EM, Summer 1862, God's Underground Highway, EM." The same initials she'd seen on the brass compass in her first survey of the artifacts. Elijah Morrison, Sarah's husband, the grandfather Ruth had mentioned but never described in detail. This map was his work, his contribution to the dangerous business of guiding people to freedom. Maya photographed the map from multiple angles, knowing she'd need time to study its implications. If Elijah's notations were accurate, the Morrison Cave was just one stop on a much larger journey. The map showed routes that extended from the Tennessee River north toward Kentucky, with symbols that seemed to indicate safe houses, supply caches, and danger points. The complexity was staggering. This wasn't the simple cave she'd thought she knew. It was part of an intricate system that had operated for years under the noses of authorities who never suspected. The worthless cave had been anything but worthless to the people who depended on it for their lives. Maya spent hours in the chamber, her notebook filling with questions as much as observations. How many people had passed through this place? How had the network remained secret? And most importantly, what had happened to end its operation? By the time she and Scout returned to the farmhouse, Maya felt overwhelmed by the scope of what she'd discovered. Ruth met them at the kitchen door, her expression expectant. "How much did you know?" Maya asked without preamble. Ruth considered the question while pouring sweet tea into tall glasses. "Enough to understand why it needed to stay hidden. Not enough to understand how much it should have been honored." That evening, Maya spread printouts of the map photos across the kitchen table, while Ruth examined them with the careful attention of someone seeing familiar territory from a new perspective. "Your great-great-grandmother Sarah was a remarkable woman," Ruth said finally, "but Elijah was the one who understood the land. He'd grown up hunting these hills, knew every cave and creek. When they decided to help, his knowledge made it possible." "Decided to help?" Maya prompted. Ruth's fingers traced one of the map's routes. "Sarah was born free, but Elijah had been enslaved until he bought his freedom. They understood what it meant to live under threat, to need safe places when the world turned dangerous. When the opportunity came to help others find freedom, they couldn't turn away." The next morning, Maya walked to the Cedar Hollow Public Library with new purpose. Mrs. Henderson greeted her with the warm smile that had made Maya feel welcome from her first visit. "Research project?" Mrs. Henderson asked, noticing Maya's notebook and serious expression. "Family history," Maya said carefully. "I'm trying to understand more about the Civil War period around here." Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up. "Oh, you'll want our local history collection. We have some wonderful resources, though I'll warn you that official records from that time can be frustratingly incomplete." She led Maya to a small section devoted to regional history, pulling books that covered slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction in Tennessee. "Dr. Reeves donated most of these," she explained. "He's done extensive research on migration patterns through this area. You might want to speak with him directly." Maya accepted the books gratefully, but hesitated at the suggestion. Something about Dr. Reeves made her cautious, though she couldn't articulate why. "Mrs. Henderson," she said carefully, "what do you know about the Morrison family history? My grandmother doesn't talk about it much." The librarian's expression grew thoughtful. "The Morrisons have been here longer than almost anyone. Good people, always involved in community affairs. Though I've heard stories, probably just rumors, about your ancestors being involved in some of the more dangerous activities during the war." "Dangerous activities?" "Oh, you know how stories grow over time. Probably nothing to them. But there were always whispers about the Morrison place being a stop on the Underground Railroad. Course, half the old families in this area have similar stories attached to them." Maya spent the afternoon reading, taking notes on everything she could find about Underground Railroad operations in Tennessee. The official histories were sanitized, focusing on famous figures and documented stations, while glossing over the countless smaller operations that had made the network function. But between the lines, Maya found hints of the reality Elijah's map had shown. References to undocumented routes through limestone cave systems, mentions of local families whose assistance was suspected but never proven, academic papers that discussed the likelihood of extensive underground networks that left no official record. Dr. Reeves appeared at her table as the afternoon light began to fade. Maya looked up to find him studying her research materials with obvious interest. "Miss Morrison," he said with the enthusiasm that characterized all his interactions, "Mrs. Henderson mentioned you're researching local Civil War history. Fascinating period in this region. I'd be happy to share some resources that aren't readily available." Maya closed her notebook carefully. What kind of resources? Primary documents mostly, letters, diary entries, official correspondence that references activities in this area. "I've been building quite a collection over the years." His offer was generous, but Maya found herself reluctant to accept. There was something in his eagerness that made her protective of her family's secrets. "That's very kind," she said politely. "I'm just starting to explore the topic. Maybe once I have a better foundation." Dr. Reeves nodded, though Maya detected disappointment in his expression. "Of course, but don't hesitate to reach out. Local history is my passion, and the Morrison family story is particularly intriguing." The way he said intriguing made Maya's skin prickle. How much did he know? And more importantly, what were his motivations for wanting to know more? Walking home with Scout as the sun set behind the Tennessee hills, Maya reflected on the day's discoveries. The map had revealed the scope of her ancestors' courage, but it had also raised new questions about how to protect their legacy. Ruth was waiting on the porch again, rocking gently in the chair that had been her mother's and her mother's before that. Maya settled into the matching chair, Scout lying down between them. "Dr. Reeves offered to help with my research," Maya said. Ruth's rocking slowed. "Did he now?" "He says he has primary documents about local Civil War activities. Mentioned the Morrison family specifically." The rocking stopped entirely. "Maya, honey, some stories need to stay family stories, not because they're shameful, but because some people would use them for their own purposes rather than honoring them properly." Maya understood. The artifacts in the chamber weren't just historical curiosities. They were evidence of extraordinary courage that deserved protection rather than exploitation. That night, she lay in bed studying the photographed map by lamplight, tracing the routes Elijah had drawn with such care. Each line represented lives saved, risks taken, trust maintained across impossible circumstances. Tomorrow, she would return to the chamber with a better understanding of what she was preserving. The Morrison family legacy wasn't just about the past. It was about the responsibility Maya now carried to honor that past, while protecting it from those who might not understand its true value. Maya's return to the chamber the next morning carried a different energy. Armed with Ruth's blessing and a deeper understanding of what she might find, she moved through the artifacts with the reverence of someone tending a sacred space. Scout settled into what had become his usual position near the entrance, alert but patient, as if he too understood the importance of what was happening here. The brass compass drew Maya's attention immediately. She'd noticed it during her initial survey, but hadn't examined it closely, distracted by more obviously significant items like the locket and map. Now lifting it carefully with cotton gloves, she felt the substantial weight of quality craftsmanship. The compass face was still clear beneath protective glass, its needle responsive despite the decades of concealment. But it was the inscription on the back that made Maya's breath catch. E.M. Guide Us True, S.M. 1861, Elijah Morrison, Sarah Morrison. A gift between husband and wife at the beginning of their dangerous work, when they committed to helping others find freedom through the Tennessee wilderness. Maya held the compass steady, watching the needle point north with the same reliability it had offered to her great-great-grandparents. The craftsmanship was exceptional, brass polished to a warm glow, engravings sharp and clear, mechanism precise. This had been an expensive gift, probably representing significant sacrifice for a young couple just beginning their married life. But Sarah had understood that Elijah's work required the best tools available. Maya opened her notebook and began documenting the compass alongside her other discoveries, but her mind kept drifting to stories Ruth had told over the years. Stories Maya had always assumed were family legends rather than historical fact. Ruth's voice echoed in Maya's memory. Your great-great-grandfather Elijah could find his way through any forest, day or night, rain or shine. People said he had a gift for navigation, but really he just paid attention to things other folks missed. At the time, sitting on the farmhouse porch during Maya's childhood visits, these stories had seemed like pleasant fairy tales. Elijah the woodsman, who never got lost. Sarah, the woman who could make anyone feel welcome in her home. Adventures. That sounded too dramatic to be real, too noble to be true. But now, holding Elijah's compass and surrounded by evidence of their courage, Maya understood that Ruth's stories had been carefully edited versions of extraordinary truth. The gift for navigation had guided freedom seekers through treacherous terrain. Sarah's welcoming home had literally meant the difference between life and death for countless people. Maya's hands trembled as she photographed the compass from every angle, capturing the inscription, the mechanism, even the small scratches that spoke of hard use in crucial moments. This wasn't just a family heirloom, it was a tool of liberation, proof that the Morrison family had actively participated in one of American history's most dangerous and noble enterprises. The chamber around her seemed to pulse with new meaning. Every artifact represented not just material preservation, but moral courage passed down through generations. The wooden bird carvings that had seemed decorative were actually signals used to communicate with Underground Railroad travelers. The simple clothing had been disguises for people leaving slavery behind. The seeds in small pouches were for establishing gardens at safe houses along the route. Maya's notebook filled with connections as pieces of the family puzzle fell into place. The journal entries that had seemed random now revealed themselves as coded communications. The maps weren't just geographical tools, but operational plans for one of the most sophisticated rescue networks in the South. But it was the personal items that moved Maya most deeply. A child's wooden toy, evidence that families, not just individuals, had passed through this sanctuary. A woman's hair ribbon carefully preserved, suggesting someone had waited here long enough to form attachments. A man's wedding ring, wrapped in cloth that bore the faded stain of tears. Each object told a story of trust. People fleeing unimaginable oppression had placed their lives in the hands of Elijah and Sarah Morrison, and that trust had been honored. The careful preservation of personal effects suggested that when people moved on to the next station, they left pieces of themselves behind, confident that their memories would be protected. Maya thought about the stories Ruth had shared during those long summer evenings when Maya was younger and more interested in immediate adventures than family history. Stories about ancestors who had helped their neighbors during difficult times, about the Morrison family's reputation for doing what was right regardless of what was popular, about caves and hiding places that had protected people who needed protection. At the time, Maya had been more interested in the cave stories than their historical context. She'd pestered Ruth for details about secret passages and hidden treasures, never understanding that the real treasure had been the lives saved and families reunited. Now, surrounded by evidence of that reality, Maya felt the weight of inheritance in a way she'd never imagined. This wasn't just about understanding where she came from, it was about understanding what she was called to continue. The compass needle held steady in her palm, pointing true north with the same reliability that had guided her ancestors through their moral choices. When faced with the decision between safety and service, between comfort and courage, Elijah and Sarah Morrison had chosen to risk everything for people they'd never met. Maya carefully returned the compass to its place among the other artifacts, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant for more than preservation. Tools were made to be used, and something about holding it had felt like receiving a commission rather than just examining a relic. The walk back to the farmhouse passed in contemplative silence. Scout seemed to sense her mood, staying close and occasionally bumping against her leg in quiet support. Maya's mind churned with new understanding about her family, her place in Cedar Hollow, and the legacy she'd inherited without knowing it. Ruth was in the garden when they arrived, tending tomato plants with the focused attention she brought to all her tasks. She looked up as Maya approached, her expression expectant. "You found Elijah's compass," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. Maya nodded, settling on the garden bench beside her grandmother. "You knew it was there." "I knew about most." "Of what was there?" Ruth admitted. "My grandmother Sarah was careful to pass down the locations and meanings before she died. But I was also taught to be careful about who we shared those meanings with." "Why didn't you tell me before?" Ruth's hands stilled on the tomato vines. "Because knowing carries responsibility, baby girl. Once you understand what your ancestors did, you can't unknow it, and you can't pretend that their courage doesn't make demands on your own." Maya absorbed this, understanding dawning. "You were waiting for me to be ready." "I was waiting for you to need it," Ruth corrected gently. "Grief has a way of making us question where we belong in the world, what our lives are worth. I thought maybe Sarah and Elijah's story might help you answer some of those questions." They sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon light slanted across the garden. Maya thought about the compass, about the trust it represented, about the courage it had facilitated. Her ancestors had faced impossible choices and had chosen to risk everything for justice. What happened to them? Maya asked finally. How did their story end? Ruth's expression grew sad. The war ended, but their work didn't stop immediately. There were still people who needed help, still dangers to navigate. But times changed, and the network had to change with them. Eventually, it wasn't needed anymore. And the chamber? Elijah sealed it in 1867, 2 years after Lee surrendered. He said the artifacts deserved to be preserved for the family that would come after, but that they needed to stay hidden until someone was ready to understand their full meaning. Maya understood. The chamber hadn't just been a hiding place. It had been a time capsule, waiting for the right moment to reveal the Morrison family's true legacy. "I want to document everything properly," Maya said. "Not for outsiders, but for our family, so the stories don't get lost again." Ruth smiled, the expression carrying decades of protective love. "I was hoping you'd say that. There's more to learn, baby girl. And Scout seems to think you're ready for the next discovery." Maya looked at the dog, who was watching them both with the intelligent attention that had become familiar. "What next discovery?" Ruth's smile widened. "The one that explains why Scout was so determined to find that wall in the first place. The one that connects our past to right now in ways you haven't imagined yet." Ruth's hands shook as she held the carved wooden bird, her weathered fingers tracing the smooth curves that had been shaped by her great-grandfather's careful knife. Maya watched from beside her in the chamber, noting how her grandmother's composed demeanor had crumbled the moment she saw the familiar artifact. "I haven't seen this since I was 7 years old," Ruth whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "My grandmother Sarah kept it on the mantelpiece, and I used to play with it while—" She told stories. The bird was small enough to fit comfortably in Ruth's palm, carved from dark walnut, with such skill that every feather seemed ready to ruffle in an imagined breeze. Its wings were spread, as if caught mid-flight. Head turned skyward in an expression of determined freedom that spoke across generations. "She told me it was just a pretty carving her husband had made," Ruth continued, tears starting to flow freely. "I never knew. I never understood what it really meant." Maya had discovered the bird among a collection of similar carvings, each one unique but sharing the same sense of movement and purpose. Based on her research, she'd suspected they were signals used in underground railroad communications, but seeing Ruth's reaction confirmed their deeper significance. "Tell me what you remember," Maya said softly. Ruth cradled the bird against her chest, her eyes distant with memory. "Sarah used to say that some birds knew how to find their way home, no matter how far they traveled. She'd hold this one up to the window and tell me to watch for real birds like it, birds that carried messages from faraway places. The memory brought fresh tears. I thought she was just being fanciful, the way old people sometimes are with children. I never imagined she was teaching me about a signal system that had saved lives. Maya had spent the morning researching the wooden birds, while Ruth prepared herself for this visit to the chamber. It was the first time her grandmother had entered the hidden space since helping to seal it 40 years earlier, and the emotional weight of returning was evident in every careful step. The birds were carved by freedom seekers, Maya explained, gently sharing what she'd learned. Each one was unique, but they all shared certain characteristics that marked them as signals. When placed in windows or on fence posts, they told conductors like Elijah and Sarah that the house was safe. Ruth nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her expression. Sarah always had birds in her windows, different ones at different times. I thought she just liked them. She was maintaining the signal system, Maya realized. Even after the war ended, she kept the tradition alive in case anyone still needed help. They sat together in the chamber's gentle coolness, surrounded by the carefully preserved artifacts that told the Morrison family story. Maya had brought battery-powered lanterns this time, casting warm light that revealed the space's true character. What had seemed like a simple cave was actually a carefully designed sanctuary with carved shelves, smoothed walls, and ventilation channels that ensured both safety and comfort. "Help me understand," Maya said. "How did it all work?" Ruth held the bird up to catch the lantern light, studying the intricate details as if seeing them for the first time. "From what my grandmother told me, it started small. Elijah and Sarah were young married folks, religious people who believed slavery was wrong. When they heard about the Underground Railroad, they wanted to help but didn't know how." She paused, gathering memories that had been passed down through whispered family stories. The first person they helped was a woman named Hannah, traveling with 2 small children. Someone from the next county sent word through church connections that they needed a safe place to rest. Elijah and Sarah turned their root cellar into a hiding place. Maya imagined her ancestors making that first crucial decision, choosing to risk their own safety for strangers in desperate need. "But one family became many families," Ruth continued. "Word spread through the network that the Morrison place was safe, reliable. Elijah knew every cave and creek in these hills, so he started developing routes that kept people hidden from the main roads." The carved bird seemed to pulse with life in Ruth's hands as she spoke. Sarah made the birds into a communication system. Different positions meant different messages. Safe passage, danger ahead, wait for further signal. The carving was always the same basic design, but each conductor would make small changes that marked them as authentic. Maya pulled out her notebook, documenting not just the artifact, but the stories that gave it meaning. "How many people passed through here?" Ruth's expression grew solemn. "Hundreds over the course of 5 years. Elijah kept records, coded but detailed. Families with children, young men escaping before they could be sold south, older couples who'd saved money for decades to buy their freedom but needed safe passage north." The scope was staggering. Maya tried to imagine the logistics, the constant fear, the careful coordination required to move so many people through hostile territory without detection. "It wasn't just Elijah and Sarah," Ruth continued. "The whole Morrison family was involved. My great-grandmother's brothers, her cousins, even some of the neighbors who could be trusted. It became a community effort disguised as normal life." Maya thought about the other artifacts she'd catalogued, clothes that could have belonged to anyone, tools that seemed ordinary, documents that looked like routine correspondence. The brilliance was in the camouflage, the way extraordinary courage had been hidden within everyday appearances. "What about the authorities?" Maya asked. "Wasn't this incredibly dangerous?" Ruth's grip on the bird tightened. "Deadly dangerous." There were slave catchers, federal marshals, local officials who supported the slave system. If they'd been caught, Elijah and Sarah could have been imprisoned or worse. The people they were helping would have been returned to slavery and probably punished severely. The weight of that risk settled over Maya like a heavy blanket. Her ancestors hadn't just been good-hearted people offering casual assistance. They'd been revolutionaries operating a sophisticated resistance network that challenged the legal and social systems of their time. So why did they do it? Maya asked. Ruth looked around the chamber, seeing not just artifacts, but the faces of people who'd found sanctuary here. Because once you understand that something is wrong, truly, deeply wrong, you can't pretend you don't know. Sarah used to say that God didn't put us on earth to be comfortable. He put us here to do right by each other, especially when doing right was difficult. Maya felt something shift inside her, a recognition that went deeper than intellectual understanding. The Morrison family legacy wasn't just about historical courage. It was about a moral framework that demanded action when faced with injustice. The bird signals, she said, studying the carving more closely. Are you saying Sarah taught you the code without telling you what it was? Ruth smiled through her tears. Looking back, yes. She'd point out birds in the woods and ask me what messages they might be carrying. She'd have me arrange her carved birds in different patterns, telling me stories about what each arrangement might mean. I thought it was just imaginative play. But, you remember? Ruth nodded slowly. Enough. The positioned tilted toward the road meant safe passage. Wings spread wide meant help needed immediately. Head turned back over the shoulder meant danger. Wait for all clear signal. Maya felt a chill of recognition. The birds around your house. You've been maintaining the signals without knowing it. Ruth's eyes widened as understanding dawned. Dear God, I thought I was just keeping family tradition alive, putting birds in the windows like my grandmother did. But I've been maintaining an active signal system for 40 years. They looked at each other across the chamber. Two Morrison. Women separated by generations, but connected by an inherited sense of purpose they were only now beginning to understand. The carved bird in Ruth's hands seemed to bridge that gap, carrying forward a legacy of courage that had never really ended. Maya, Ruth said quietly, I think it's time you understood why Scout found you, and why he was so determined to reveal this chamber. The Underground Railroad network may be history, but the need for safe passage, for people who will stand up when others need help, that never went away. Maya felt the truth of those words settle into her bones, bringing with them both weight and wings. Maya discovered the freedom papers tucked inside a leather portfolio she'd initially overlooked among the larger artifacts. The documents were protected by oiled cloth and arranged with the same careful attention to preservation that characterized everything in the chamber. But when she unfolded the first document, her hands went numb with shock. The papers were forgeries. Expertly crafted documents designed to help enslaved people pass as free individuals during their journey north. Names had been changed, ages adjusted, physical descriptions modified to match the travelers who would carry them. But what made Maya's breath catch was the quality of the work. These weren't crude attempts at deception. They were masterpieces of forger's art, complete with official seals, watermarks, and signatures that would have fooled all but the most expert examination. Sarah's work, Ruth said quietly, examining the documents over Maya's shoulder. I never knew she was so skilled. The papers told stories of desperate hope and careful preparation. Freedom Pass for James Washington, age 28, traveling to visit. Family in Ohio. Certificate of manumission for Mary Johnson and children, granted freedom by master's will. Work papers for Thomas Brown, carpenter, seeking employment in Indiana. Each document represented someone's bid for freedom, their chance to walk openly on roads where they'd previously had to hide. Maya tried to imagine Sarah Morrison sitting at her kitchen table in the lamplight, carefully copying official letterheads, and practicing signatures that might mean the difference between liberty and recapture. The Underground Railroad couldn't function without documents like these, Maya whispered, understanding dawning. People needed to be able to explain themselves. If they were stopped, Ruth nodded, her expression grave. It was one of the most dangerous parts of the operation. Getting caught with forged papers meant prison for the people who made them, and probably death for the people who carried them. Maya was photographing the documents when Scout's sharp bark from outside the chamber made both women freeze. The dog's alert was different from his usual warnings about small animals or unfamiliar sounds. This carried urgency that suggested human approach. They quickly gathered the papers and moved toward the chamber entrance, Maya's heart pounding as she realized how vulnerable they were in the hidden space. If someone discovered them here with the artifacts spread out for examination, explaining their presence would be impossible. Scout met them at the main cave entrance, his body rigid with attention, focused toward the path they usually took from. The farmhouse. Maya could hear voices now, multiple people moving through the woods with less care for stealth than she and Ruth always used. "Maya! Maya Morrison, are you in there?" The voice belonged to Dr. Reeves, but he wasn't alone. Ruth caught Maya's arm, her grip tight with warning. They remained silent, hoping the visitors would assume the cave was empty and leave, but Scout's earlier barking had given away their presence. "We know someone's been exploring this cave regularly," came another voice, one Maya didn't recognize. "Fresh footprints, recent disturbances. If Maya's in there, she needs to come out so we can talk." Ruth's whispered, "Stay quiet," came too late. Maya could hear the strangers entering the main chamber, their flashlight beams dancing across walls. She'd come to think of as private sanctuary. "Hello?" Dr. Reeves called again. "Maya, if you're back there, please come out. We're not here to cause trouble. We just want to talk about what you found." Maya's mind raced through options. The chamber entrance was well concealed, but determined. Searchers might discover it if they spent enough time looking. And Scout's continued agitation suggested more people were approaching from other directions. "Maya." Ruth's voice carried the authority that had guided the Morrison family through generations of difficult decisions. "We need to face this directly. Hiding will only make things worse." They emerged from behind the concealed entrance together. Ruth, carrying the portfolio of freedom papers, while Maya held her notebook and camera. Scout immediately positioned himself between his family and the strangers, his growl low but unmistakable. Dr. Reeves stood near the center of the main chamber, flanked by two men Maya had never seen before. The first was roughly her father's age, wearing expensive outdoor gear that looked fresh from the store. The second was older, dressed in a business suit that seemed completely inappropriate for cave exploration. "Maya, thank goodness," Dr. Reeves said with obvious relief. "When Mrs. Henderson mentioned you'd been researching Underground Railroad activities, I became concerned about what you might have stumbled into. These caves can be dangerous for inexperienced explorers." His concern felt manufactured, and Maya noticed how his companions were examining the chamber walls with professional interest rather than casual curiosity. "This is Jake Morrison," Dr. Reeves continued, indicating the younger man. "No relation despite the name. He's a treasure hunter who specializes in Civil War artifacts. And this is Preston Burke, a local land developer who's been researching the historical significance of this area." Maya felt Ruth tense beside her. Preston Burke's name had come up in conversations at the library and general store. He was known for buying properties with development potential, often displacing long-time residents in favor of commercial projects. "Young lady," Burke said, with the kind of condescending smile adults used when they wanted children to feel important while being ignored, "we understand you've been spending considerable time in these caves. We're hoping you might share what you've discovered. Historical finds can be quite valuable, both academically and financially." The way he emphasized valuable made Maya's skin crawl. This wasn't about historical preservation. It was about profit. Jake Morrison stepped forward, his equipment clearly expensive and professional. "I've been researching Underground Railroad sites throughout Tennessee. If this location was actually used as a station, the artifacts here could be worth significant money to collectors and museums." Worth money to whom? Ruth's voice carried ice that Maya had never heard before. Morrison shrugged. To whoever finds them, legally speaking. Tennessee has fairly straightforward laws about treasure hunting on private property, assuming proper permissions are obtained. Maya understood the threat implicit in his words. These men weren't just interested in what she'd found, they were positioning themselves to claim it if the opportunity arose. "What's in the portfolio?" Burke asked, his attention focused on the documents Ruth held. "Family papers," Ruth replied firmly. "Nothing that would interest outsiders." Dr. Reeves' expression grew more intense. "Maya, I hope you understand the historical significance of anything you might have discovered here. These artifacts belong to the academic community, to researchers who can properly interpret and preserve them for future generations." Maya felt caught between competing claims on something that felt fundamentally hers. These were her family's artifacts, her ancestors' legacy, preserved by generations of Morrison care. But the men spoke with the authority of adult experts who clearly believed they knew better than a 13-year-old girl and her elderly grandmother. "We haven't found anything significant," Maya said carefully. "Just some old bottles and personal items that probably belong to hunters or hobbyists." Burke smiled in a way that suggested he didn't believe her. "Of course, but if you should discover anything more substantial, I hope you'll contact us immediately. Historical preservation is too important to be left to amateur hands." The condescension in his tone sparked anger Maya hadn't expected. These men were talking about her family's courage, her ancestors' risk-taking, as if it were commodity to be bought and sold, rather than legacy to be honored. "Maya's been very responsible in her explorations," Ruth said with quiet dignity. "The Morrison family has always taken care of what belongs to us." "Absolutely," Dr. Reeves agreed quickly, "but academic resources could help determine the true significance of any finds. Carbon dating, historical authentication, proper preservation techniques, these require professional facilities." Maya watched Scout during the conversation, noting how the dog's attention remained focused on Burke rather than the other men. His instincts about people had proven reliable, and his obvious distrust of the developer felt significant. "We should be getting back," Ruth said firmly. "Maya has chores waiting, and these caves will be here tomorrow if anyone needs to return." The dismissal was polite, but absolute. Maya gathered her materials quickly, grateful for her grandmother's intervention, but aware that this confrontation had changed everything. Word was spreading about her discoveries, and people with different agendas were taking interest. As they made their way back toward the farmhouse, Maya could hear the three men remaining in the cave, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. They were discussing search techniques, legal procedures for treasure hunting, and the potential value of underground railroad artifacts. "We need to be more careful," Ruth said quietly, once they were out of earshot. Maya nodded, clutching her notebook and thinking about the freedom papers in the portfolio. Her ancestors had faced similar threats from people who wanted to claim what didn't belong to them, who saw other people's courage as opportunity for their own advancement. The difference was that Sarah and Elijah Morrison had been prepared for such challenges. Maya was still learning what preparation looked like in her own time, with threats that wore business suits and academic credentials rather than badges and slave-catcher licenses. But as Scout pressed close to her side during the walk home, Maya felt some of her ancestors' determination stirring to life. The Morrison family had protected what mattered before. They would find a way to do it again. Maya couldn't sleep that night, her mind churning with worry about the men who'd invaded their sanctuary. She kept thinking about Burke's confident assertion that Tennessee law would support his treasure hunting claims, and Dr. Reeves's assumption that academic institutions had automatic rights to historical discoveries. The freedom papers lay hidden in her dresser drawer, along with photographs of all the other artifacts she'd documented. But for the first time since finding the chamber, Maya felt like their family legacy was under direct threat. Scout seemed equally restless, pacing between Maya's bed and the window that overlooked the path to the caves. His behavior suggested he sensed danger that extended beyond the afternoon's confrontation. At dawn, Maya found Ruth in the kitchen, already dressed and preparing a larger breakfast than usual. Her grandmother's expression carried the determined, a calm that Maya had learned to recognize as preparation for significant action. "We're going back to the chamber," Ruth said without preamble. "There are things I need to show you, things I should have shared earlier. That encounter yesterday made me realize we can't wait any longer." They walked to the cave in companionable silence, both women lost in thought about the challenges they faced. Scout ranged ahead as always, but his alertness suggested continued concern about unwelcome visitors. The morning mist clung to the valleys, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made Maya feel like they were walking through family history rather than just across familiar hills. The chamber welcomed them with its usual coolness, but Maya noticed details she'd missed before. Ventilation shafts that suggested the space had been designed for extended occupation, carved handholds that made climbing to higher shelves easier, even what appeared to be a natural water source in one corner. This hadn't been just a hiding place, it had been a carefully engineered sanctuary. Ruth moved directly to the shelf where Maya had found the locket, reaching behind it to retrieve something she'd somehow missed in all her careful cataloguing. The item was wrapped in multiple layers of oiled cloth and had been tucked so far back that only someone who knew exactly where to look could have found it. "Family insurance policy," Ruth said with grim humor as she unwrapped a metal document case. Sarah Morrison was too smart to leave the family's security to chance. The case contained papers that made Maya's understanding of their situation shift dramatically. The first document was a deed of ownership dated 1859, written in formal legal language, but clear in its implications. Elijah Morrison had purchased not just the cave system, but nearly 300 acres of surrounding hillside. Maya studied the deed carefully, tracing property lines that extended far beyond what she'd imagined the Morrison family owned. The cave was just one feature of a large tract that included multiple limestone formations, several springs, and significant timber. "Rights, 300 acres, Maya whispered. "But Nana Ruth, you've never mentioned owning all this land." Ruth's expression grew complicated. "Because we've never used most of it, never developed it, never really thought of it as valuable property. My grandmother, Sarah, believed the land should stay wild, stay available for anyone who needed refuge. The family has just been paying taxes on it for generations without really considering what we had." But the real revelation came in the second document, a survey map commissioned by Elijah Morrison in 1863 that showed the true extent of the cave system. What Maya had assumed was a single chamber with limited passages was actually part of a vast underground network that extended throughout their property and beyond. The map revealed multiple entrances, connected tunnels that created safe routes across miles of territory, and chambers large enough to accommodate dozens of people. Elijah hadn't just found one useful cave. He'd discovered and mapped an entire subterranean highway that could move freedom seekers invisibly across hostile territory. "This is incredible," Maya breathed, studying the survey details. "No wonder the underground railroad network here was so successful. They had a complete hidden transportation system." Ruth nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "And now you understand why Preston Burke is so interested. If he could gain access to this property, he could develop it into something that would make him very wealthy." The third document made the threat explicit. Burke had already filed preliminary development plans with the county, proposing a resort and conference center that would require extensive excavation throughout the limestone formations. His plans included removal of unstable cave systems and grading of hillside areas for construction access. Maya felt sick reading the development proposal. Burke's project would destroy not just the chamber where they sat, but the entire network. her ancestors had risked their lives to maintain. Centuries of geological formation and decades of careful preservation would be obliterated for a commercial venture that would erase the Morrison family legacy completely. How did he get these? Plans approved without our permission, Maya demanded. Ruth's jaw tightened. Because he doesn't need our permission if he can prove the property has been abandoned or that the current owners can't demonstrate legal claim. He's gambling that we don't have proper documentation of ownership. But they did have documentation. Extensive, detailed, and legally binding evidence that the Morrison family had owned this land continuously for more than 150 years. The deed was clear, the property lines were established, and the tax records Ruth had maintained proved continuous stewardship. He doesn't know about these papers, Maya realized. Nobody knows about these papers, Ruth confirmed. Sarah hid them. Too well. Even I wasn't sure they still existed until yesterday's confrontation made me remember exactly where she'd put them. Maya studied the survey map more carefully, beginning to understand the true scope of what they were protecting. This wasn't just about preserving historical artifacts. It was about maintaining stewardship of a landscape that had sheltered generations of people seeking safety and freedom. The implications were staggering. If the cave system was as extensive as Elijah's survey suggested, there might be other chambers, other collections of artifacts, other stories waiting to be discovered. The network could contain evidence of underground railroad operations that would revolutionize academic understanding of how the system actually functioned. But it could also contain evidence that would attract exactly the kind of attention Maya most wanted to avoid. Treasure hunters, historians, developers, and government agencies would all have different claims on what the Morrison family had preserved for so long. What do we do? Maya asked. Ruth folded the documents carefully, her movements deliberate and thoughtful. We do what Morrison women have always done when our family's integrity was threatened. We protect what matters, and we prepare to fight for what's right. The steel in her grandmother's voice reminded Maya of Sarah Morrison's determination, of the courage that had sustained the Underground Railroad network through years of danger. This was the same struggle in a different form, protecting people and principles from those who would exploit them for personal gain. But Maya, Ruth continued, you need to understand what we're choosing. If we assert our ownership publicly, if we file legal challenges to Burke's development plans, we'll be declaring that this land and its history belong to us. There will be no more quiet preservation, no more family secrets. Everything will become public knowledge, Maya thought, about the artifacts surrounding them, about the stories they told of courage and sacrifice. Her ancestors had chosen action over safety when justice was at stake. Could she choose differently when their legacy itself was threatened? Scout's sudden alert bark echoed from the main cave chamber, indicating that their morning solitude was about to be interrupted. Maya quickly helped Ruth rewrap the documents and secure them in their hiding place before they emerged to face whatever new challenge awaited. Jake Morrison stood in the main chamber, but this time he wasn't alone. He'd brought professional equipment, ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, surveying instruments that suggested he was planning extensive exploration rather than casual investigation. Ladies, he said with false friendliness, I hope you don't mind my returning so early. I realized yesterday that I may have been hasty in my assessment of this site's potential. I'd like to conduct a more thorough survey, with your permission, of course. Maya felt Ruth tense beside her. Morrison was obviously hoping they didn't understand the legal implications of giving permission for professional treasure hunting on property they might not legally control. Mr. Morrison, Ruth said with careful politeness, I'm afraid that won't be possible. This is private property, and we don't give permission for commercial excavation. His smile faltered. Of course, but I should mention that my research suggests the legal ownership of this particular tract might be somewhat complicated. Historical properties sometimes have unclear title chains, especially when families haven't maintained proper documentation. The threat was clear, but indirect. He was gambling that they couldn't prove ownership and hoping to pressure them into cooperation through intimidation. Maya felt anger rising, the same moral indignation that had driven her ancestors to risk everything for justice. These men were trying to steal her family's legacy through legal manipulation and bureaucratic pressure. But Ruth simply smiled with the quiet confidence of someone holding superior cards in a high-stakes game. "Mr. Morrison," she said pleasantly, "I believe you'll find that the Morrison family documentation is quite thorough. We've maintained continuous legal ownership of this property since 1859. If you'd like to proceed with any commercial activities, you'll need to negotiate with us." As the established landowners, Maya watched Morrison's expression shift from confidence to uncertainty to something approaching alarm. He hadn't expected organized resistance from an elderly woman and a teenage girl. The battle for the Morrison family legacy had begun, and Maya realized they might actually have the weapons needed to win it. The week following Jake Morrison's failed intimidation attempt brought a flurry of unwelcome attention to the Morrison farmhouse. Maya watched from her bedroom window as official-looking vehicles made their way up the gravel drive with increasing frequency. County assessors, historical society representatives, legal clerks delivering documents, and reporters who'd caught wind of a potential Underground Railroad discovery. Ruth handled each visitor with the same polite firmness, accepting paperwork when required, but revealing nothing about the true extent of what they'd found. Maya marveled at her grandmother's composure under pressure, recognizing the same steel that had enabled Sarah Morrison to forge freedom papers while slave catchers prowled the countryside. But the mounting pressure was taking its toll. Maya could see the exhaustion in Ruth's eyes during their quiet evening meals, the way her hands sometimes trembled when she thought no one was watching. The woman who'd spent decades protecting family secrets was being forced to navigate a very public battle for which nothing in her experience had prepared her. "We need to complete the exploration," Ruth said on Thursday evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the hills that might soon be transformed into commercial development. "Before this situation gets completely out of our control, you need to see everything the cave system contains." Maya understood. Once lawyers and court proceedings took over, their private access to the family sanctuary would end. Whatever discoveries awaited in the deeper chambers would become part of legal evidence rather than personal inheritance. Scout seemed to sense the urgency that had infected the household. His usual playful energy had been replaced by constant vigilance, and he'd begun following Maya and Ruth more closely, as if his protective instincts warned of threats they couldn't yet see. The next morning brought Maya's most significant exploration yet. Following Elijah's survey map, she and Scout made their way to what the historical documents suggested was the network's most important chamber, a large space that had served as the primary coordination center for Underground Railroad operations. Passage to reach it required crawling through a narrow tunnel that opened after 50 yards into a cathedral-like chamber that took Maya's breath away. Her flashlight beam revealed a space easily 3 times the size of the original hiding place, with a soaring ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. But it was the preservation that amazed her most. This chamber had been sealed more carefully than the others, protected by multiple barriers that had maintained near-perfect conditions for more than a century. The artifacts here weren't just preserved, they were pristine. Tables and chairs, arranged as if their users had just stepped away. Maps covering every wall, showing not just local routes, but connections that extended across multiple states. Communication equipment that spoke of sophisticated coordination among dozens of conductors. And books. So many books that Maya realized this had been both operational headquarters and educational center. But it was the signal lantern that made Maya understand the true scope of what her ancestors had accomplished. The lantern sat on a central table, its brass fittings polished and its glass chimney clear. But this wasn't just any lamp. It was a specialized device designed for long-distance communication. Multiple colored glass panels could be rotated into position, creating complex coded signals visible for miles across the Tennessee hills. Maya lifted the lantern carefully, surprised to find it still contained oil and that the wick showed signs of recent use. Someone had maintained this equipment, keeping it ready for operation long after the Underground Railroad had ended. "Ruth," she whispered to herself, understanding flooding through her. Her grandmother hadn't just preserved family stories. She'd maintained operational capability, just in case. The discovery protocols her ancestors had established weren't just historical curiosities. They were active systems that Ruth had kept functional across decades. The bird signals, the cave maintenance, the careful protection of access routes, all of it had been perpetuated by a woman who understood that the need for sanctuary could arise again. Maya spent hours in the cathedral chamber, documenting artifacts that revealed the Underground Railroad network's true sophistication. These hadn't been desperate, improvised efforts. They were military precision operations run by people who understood logistics, security, and long-term planning. Communication logs showed coordination with conductors as far north as Canada and as far south as Mississippi. Supply inventories indicated stockpiling of food, clothing, and medical supplies sufficient to support hundreds of travelers. Training manuals detailed security procedures, emergency protocols, and backup plans that would have impressed modern intelligence agencies. But most importantly, Maya found evidence that the network hadn't ended with the Civil War. Operations had continued into Reconstruction, helping freed slaves navigate the dangerous transition to legal freedom. The chambers had later sheltered civil rights workers, victims of domestic violence, and others who needed safe passage through hostile territory. The Morrison family legacy wasn't just historical, it was a continuing tradition of providing sanctuary for people in crisis. Scout's urgent barking from the outer chamber interrupted Maya's discoveries. The sound carried a warning tone she'd learned to recognize. Multiple people approaching with intent that felt threatening rather than friendly. Maya quickly secured the most significant artifacts and made her way back through the narrow passage, her heart pounding as she realized how vulnerable she was in the deep underground chambers. If hostile forces gained control of the cave entrances, she could be trapped indefinitely. She emerged to find Scout positioned defensively at the main chamber entrance, his attention focused toward sounds of heavy equipment being moved through the woods. Through the cave opening, Maya could see lights moving among the trees, powerful spotlights that suggested professional operation rather than casual exploration. Ruth appeared at the cave mouth, her expression grim. "They're moving faster than we expected. Burke has brought construction equipment, claiming he needs to assess the site's stability before the county approves his development permits." Maya understood the strategy. If Burke could demonstrate that the cave system was unsafe or unstable, he could justify immediate excavation that would destroy evidence of the Morrison family's legal claim to the property. "How much time do we have?" Maya asked. Ruth checked her watch. "His permits allow him to begin preliminary work at dawn tomorrow." "But Maya, there's something else. Dr. Reeves has been asking questions around town about Underground Railroad artifacts. I think he's trying to build a case for academic seizure of whatever we've found." The threats were converging from multiple directions: commercial development, treasure hunting, and academic appropriation. Each group had different motivations, but all would result in the Morrison family losing control of their ancestral legacy. "What about the Historical Preservation Society?" Maya asked. Ruth's expression brightened slightly. "Actually, there's potential help there. I called the State Historical Preservation Office, and they're sending a representative tomorrow morning. If we can demonstrate that this is a legitimate historical site with proper family documentation, they might be able to halt Burke's development permits." Maya felt a spark of hope. but also recognition of how much depended on the next day's confrontations. Everything they'd worked to preserve across generations would be decided in a few crucial hours. "We need to prepare," Maya said, thinking about the signal lantern and the communication systems her ancestors had established. "If we're going to protect this legacy, we need to use every advantage they left us." Ruth smiled with the first real confidence Maya had seen in days. "What did you have in mind?" Maya thought about the network maps, the communication protocols, the careful planning that had enabled the Underground Railroad to operate successfully for years under hostile surveillance. "We're going to activate the Morrison family emergency procedures," she said. "All of them." That evening, Maya and Ruth worked by lamplight in the cathedral chamber, preparing for what they both understood would be the decisive battle. The signal lantern was cleaned and positioned for maximum visibility from the hillsides, where sympathetic neighbors might see its message. The bird signal codes were reviewed and updated for modern communications. Emergency supplies were staged at multiple locations throughout the cave network. Most importantly, Maya compiled a complete photographic record of every artifact, every map, every piece of evidence that proved the Morrison family's historical significance and legal ownership of the property. If tomorrow's confrontation went badly, at least the documentation would survive. Scout seemed to understand the gravity of their preparations. He moved between them with focused attention, alert to every sound from outside, while remaining calm enough not to interfere with their work. As they made final preparations to leave the chamber, Maya paused at the table where the signal lantern waited for tomorrow's use. The brass surface reflected the flashlight beams, creating patterns of light that seemed to dance with their own life. "Sarah would be proud," Ruth said quietly, understanding Maya's thoughts. Maya touched the lantern gently, feeling connection to the ancestor whose courage had made tomorrow's battle possible. "I hope we're ready for this." Ruth placed a weathered hand on Maya's shoulder, and Maya felt the strength of generations flowing between them. "We're Morrison women, baby girl. We're always ready to protect what matters." Outside, the sounds of heavy equipment grew closer as Burke's forces prepared for their assault on the family sanctuary. But inside the chamber, surrounded by artifacts that testified to generations of successful resistance, Maya felt something she hadn't expected. She felt ready to win. Dawn came gray and threatening, with low clouds that seemed to press down on the Tennessee hills like a physical weight. Maya woke to the sound of diesel engines in the distance and knew that Burke's construction crews were already mobilizing for their assault on the cave system. She found Ruth in the kitchen, dressed in her best church clothes and wearing the pearl necklace that had belonged to Sarah Morrison. Her grandmother's expression carried the quiet dignity Maya had come to associate with Morrison women facing crucial moments. "Today we find out what our family legacy is truly worth," Ruth said, pressing a thermos of coffee into Maya's hands. "Whatever happens, I want you to remember that your ancestors would be proud of how you've honored their memory." Scout paced restlessly between the kitchen and front door, his agitation suggesting he sensed the approaching confrontation. Maya realized that whatever happened today would change their lives irrevocably. Either they would successfully protect their heritage, or they would lose it forever to forces beyond their control. The first vehicles arrived before 8 o'clock. Preston Burke's construction crew came in force, heavy equipment, excavation tools, and enough workers to begin immediate demolition if their permits proved valid. Maya watched from the porch as the convoy parked near the path to the caves. Their presence, a stark invasion of the peaceful landscape her family had protected for generations. Dr. Reeves arrived shortly after, accompanied by 2 men in academic dress who carried themselves with the authority of university officials. Maya recognized the type from her research. Scholars who viewed historical artifacts as intellectual property that belonged to institutions rather than families. But it was Jake Morrison who made Maya's blood run cold. The treasure hunter had brought professional equipment that spoke of serious commercial excavation. ground-penetrating radar, industrial metal detectors, and tools designed to strip artifacts from archaeological sites with maximum efficiency and minimal regard for day. Preservation. Ruth met the converging forces with calm authority, the property deed and supporting documents clutched in her weathered hands. "Gentlemen," she said politely, "I believe there's been some misunderstanding about the legal status of this property." Burke stepped forward, with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating opponents into submission. "Mrs. Morrison, I respect your family's sentimental attachment to this land, but my development permits are valid and my contracts are binding. If you have legal objections, you'll need to file them through proper channels." "Which I have," Ruth replied, producing official letters from the State Historical Preservation Office and County Land Records Department. "This property has been continuously owned by the Morrison family since 1859, and preliminary review suggests it qualifies for historical protection status." Maya watched the men's expressions change as they realized their opposition was more organized than expected, but instead of retreating, they seemed to double down on their aggressive approach. "Academic interest trumps family claims when significant historical discoveries are involved," announced one of the university officials. "If Underground Railroad artifacts are present on this site, they belong to the scholarly community for proper research and preservation." Jake Morrison was more direct. "Look, ladies, you're in over your heads. Historical artifacts require professional handling, and frankly, you don't have the resources or expertise to manage what might be here." Maya felt anger rising at the condescension in their voices, the assumption that her family's heritage was too important to be left in family hands. These men were talking about her ancestors' courage as if it were commodity to be harvested rather than legacy to be honored. "Maya," Ruth's voice carried a warning, "remember what we discussed." The plan they'd developed required Maya to access the cathedral chamber one final time, retrieving the most significant artifacts while the adults were distracted by legal negotiations. If the confrontation went badly, at least the most important evidence would be secured. Maya slipped away from the growing argument and made her way toward the cave, Scout following with obvious reluctance. The dog's instincts clearly warned against separating from Ruth during a crisis, but his loyalty to Maya overrode his protective concerns. The cathedral chamber welcomed them with its familiar coolness, but Maya felt the weight of finality as she gathered the artifacts that absolutely could not be lost. Sarah's original journal, Elijah's survey maps, the freedom papers that proved the scope of their ancestors' courage, but it was in the deepest corner of the chamber that Maya made her final discovery, a fragment of letter bearing a signature that made her hands shake with recognition. The paper was aged and brittle, protected by the same oiled cloth that had preserved other crucial documents. But the handwriting was clear enough to read, "Mr. Morrison, your service to the Union cause and to the cause of human freedom will not be forgotten. With deepest gratitude, A. Lincoln." Abraham Lincoln had personally acknowledged Elijah Morrison's contribution to the Underground Railroad. The President of the United States had known about their family's courage and had taken time to express his appreciation. This single fragment of correspondence elevated the Morrison legacy from local history to national significance. Maya photographed the letter carefully, understanding that this discovery changed everything. No academic institution, no treasure hunter, no commercial developer could claim superior right to artifacts that had been personally recognized by a president as belonging to the Morrison family heritage. But as she prepared to leave the chamber, Scout's sharp bark of alarm echoed from outside. The confrontation above had escalated, and Maya realized she might be too late to help Ruth face whatever crisis was developing. The sound of shouting voices and heavy equipment moving closer to the cave entrance made Maya's decision for her. She sealed the most precious artifacts in waterproof containers and secured them in hiding places throughout the chamber, following protocols Sarah Morrison had established for protecting irreplaceable treasures from hostile forces. When she emerged from the cave, she found Ruth surrounded by the three groups of men, their earlier negotiating civility replaced by open hostility. Burke's workers were setting up excavation equipment, while the academics argued about seizure procedures, and Morrison threatened legal action if anyone interfered with his treasure hunting permits. Scout immediately positioned himself between Maya and the hostile forces, his growl carrying a warning that made even the construction workers step back. But Maya could see the situation was deteriorating toward confrontation that could turn dangerous. "Stop!" Maya called out, her voice carrying across the clearing with surprising authority. "All of you need to stop right now." The men turned toward her with expressions ranging from annoyance to condescension, clearly expecting a child's voice to be easily dismissed. But Maya held up the photographed Lincoln letter, its presidential seal visible even in the dim morning light. "This property contains artifacts that were personally acknowledged by President Lincoln," she announced. "Anyone who disturbs this site without Morrison family permission will be destroying presidentially recognized historical treasures." The sudden silence that followed told Maya her gamble had worked. These men might be willing to intimidate a teenage girl and her elderly grandmother, but none of them wanted to be responsible for destroying artifacts that carried presidential significance. The battle for the Morrison family legacy had reached its decisive moment, and Maya realized she was no longer the vulnerable child these men had expected to intimidate. The photograph of Lincoln's letter created a moment of stunned silence that Maya recognized as her opportunity to seize control of the situation. She stepped forward with confidence she didn't entirely feel, Scout moving alongside her with the protective alertness that had become their partnership signature. The Morrison family has maintained continuous stewardship of this historical site for more than 150 years. Maya continued, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd learned from Ruth. "We have documentation, artifacts, and now presidential correspondence that proves our legal and moral right to determine how this legacy is preserved." Preston Burke recovered first, his businessman's instincts recognizing a negotiation tactic when he saw one. "Young lady, one letter fragment doesn't change the fundamental legal situation. My development permits are valid, and your family's sentimental attachments don't override legitimate commercial interests." But Maya noticed uncertainty in his voice that hadn't been there moments before. The Lincoln letter had shifted the dynamics in ways none of them had anticipated. Dr. Reeves stepped forward with academic eagerness that barely concealed his calculation. "Maya, if you truly have correspondence from President Lincoln, then you understand why this discovery needs professional scholarly attention. The historical implications are enormous, which is exactly why they need to stay with the family that preserved them," Maya replied firmly. "Academic institutions want to own our ancestors' courage. Treasure hunters want to profit from their sacrifice. Developers want to destroy the places where they risked everything for justice." Jake Morrison tried a different approach, pulling out legal documents that he'd obviously prepared for this moment. "Listen, kid, I appreciate family pride, but there are legal procedures for handling significant archaeological discoveries. If you try to obstruct legitimate recovery operations, you could face serious charges." The threat was clear and probably valid, but Maya had spent enough time in the cathedral chamber to understand something these men didn't. Her ancestors had faced much worse intimidation and had developed strategies for overcoming superior force through superior preparation. "Mr. Morrison," Maya said politely, "I wonder if you've checked your insurance coverage for excavating presidentially protected historical sites without proper federal permits." His confident expression faltered as he realized the implications. Federal involvement would bring regulatory scrutiny that could complicate his treasure hunting operations indefinitely. But it was Scout who provided the decisive moment. The German Shepherd had been growing increasingly agitated as the men's voices rose in hostility, and when Burke stepped aggressively toward Maya, the dog's protective instincts overrode his usual restraint. Scout's warning growl was low and unmistakable, his body positioned to defend against any threat to his family. But more importantly, his alert bark echoed across the hills with the carrying power that had made him such an effective sentinel. The answering barks came from multiple directions, other dogs throughout the valley responding to Scout's alarm. Call with the instinctive communication network that connected rural communities across distance and difference. Within minutes, vehicles began arriving from directions Maya hadn't expected. Neighbors she knew only by sight, community members who'd heard rumors about the confrontation, and local officials who'd been monitoring the situation from a respectful distance. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the first car, followed by several members of the Cedar Hollow Historical Society. Behind them came farmers, whose families had lived in the valley for generations, people who understood the importance of protecting community heritage from outsiders who didn't respect local values. "Maya Morrison," Mrs. Henderson called out with librarian authority, "I hope you're not letting these gentlemen intimidate you about your family's historical legacy." Her statement carried the weight of community support that transformed the dynamic completely. This was no longer three groups of professional men overwhelming a teenage girl and her elderly grandmother. It was outside interests facing a unified community that had decided to protect its own. Ruth appeared at Maya's side, and Maya saw tears in her grandmother's eyes as she realized that generations of quiet Morrison community service had earned them allies they'd never expected. "What's in your hand, baby girl?" Ruth asked softly, noticing the small object Maya had retrieved from the cathedral chamber during her final survey. Maya opened her palm to reveal a golden thimble, worn smooth by generations of use, but still gleaming with the warm luster that spoke of precious metal. Engraved around the band were the initials SM and a date, 1863. "Sarah's thimble," Ruth whispered. Understanding immediately, Maya nodded, holding the tiny artifact up for everyone to see. This belonged to Sarah Morrison, the woman who sewed freedom papers by lamplight while slave catchers searched the countryside. She used this thimble while creating forged documents that helped hundreds of people escape slavery. The community members pressed closer, recognizing the significance of holding an artifact that connected them directly to their area's most courageous historical moment. "Sarah Morrison," announced Dr. Reeves with obvious excitement, "was one of the most important Underground Railroad conductors in Tennessee. If you have her personal effects, along with correspondence from Lincoln, then we have everything we need to protect this site from commercial exploitation," interrupted Mrs. Henderson firmly, "and to ensure that the Morrison family maintains control of their ancestral heritage." Maya felt the shift in momentum as the community rallied around their family legacy. Preston Burke's construction workers began loading their equipment without being asked, recognizing that their permits wouldn't protect them against unified local opposition. Jake Morrison was already calculating whether the legal complications outweighed potential profits, his aggressive confidence replaced by careful assessment. Dr. Reeves made one final attempt to assert academic claims. "Surely we can reach an agreement that preserves scholarly access while respecting family ownership." Maya looked at Ruth, seeing approval in her grandmother's expression. "Dr. Reeves, the Morrison family has always supported education and historical preservation, but we'll be selecting partners who understand that some discoveries are too important to be owned by anyone except the families who preserved them." As the various threats retreated and community support solidified around them, Maya realized that the battle for their family legacy had been won not through legal maneuvering or political pressure, but through the same community bonds that had sustained the Underground Railroad network more than a century earlier. Scout pressed against her side, his protective vigilance relaxing as the immediate danger passed. In her palm, Sarah Morrison's golden thimble caught the morning light, connecting past and present in a moment of triumph that would have made her ancestors proud. The Morrison family heritage was safe, protected by the same community values that had sustained it across generations of challenge and change. 6 months later, Maya stood before the bronze plaque that marked the entrance to what was now officially designated as the Morrison Family Underground Railroad Historical Preserve. The morning sun caught the polished metal surface, illuminating words that had been carefully chosen to honor both historical accuracy and family pride. Morrison Family Underground Railroad Station, 1859-1867. In recognition of the courage of Sarah and Elijah Morrison, conductors who guided more than 300 freedom seekers through these chambers to safety, maintained by the Morrison family for the education and inspiration of future generations. Dedicated by Maya Morrison, age 14, junior curator, the plaque represented more than official recognition. It embodied the transformation of private family legacy into public educational mission while maintaining Morrison family stewardship. Maya ran her fingers over the raised letters, still, marveling at how much her life had changed since that first afternoon when Scout had started digging at the chamber wall. Ready for today's tour group? Ruth called from the visitor center they'd constructed near the farmhouse. The building was modest but functional, designed to provide historical context for visitors while protecting the cave system from excessive traffic. Maya nodded, adjusting the junior curator badge she wore with pride. The Tennessee Historical Commission had created the position specifically for her, after recognizing that the Morrison family knowledge was irreplaceable and that Maya's connection to the site made her its most authentic interpreter. The morning tour group consisted of a middle school class from Nashville, their teacher having scheduled the visit as part of their Civil War unit. Maya had discovered that she enjoyed sharing her ancestors' story with young people who were old enough to understand the moral complexity of the choices Sarah and Elijah Morrison had faced. Scout accompanied her as always, now wearing an official therapy dog vest that recognized his role in helping visitors connect emotionally with the historical experience. His presence seemed to comfort children who were processing difficult truths about slavery and resistance, and his story of discovery had become part of the standard tour narrative. Welcome to the Morrison Family Underground Railroad Preserve. Maya began as the students gathered around the cave entrance. Before we go inside, I want you to think about what it means to choose courage when courage is dangerous. She had refined her presentation over months of practice, learning to balance historical accuracy with age-appropriate emotional impact. The key was helping visitors understand that the people who had operated this network weren't mythical heroes, but ordinary individuals who had made extraordinary choices when faced with clear moral imperatives. The tour moved through the original chamber where Maya had first found Sarah's locket, then through the connecting passages to the cathedral chamber that now served as the preserve's educational centerpiece. Professional lighting had been installed to protect the artifacts while allowing visitors to appreciate the space's impressive scale. This was the nerve center of the operation, Maya explained as the students examined Elijah's survey maps and communication equipment. Your ancestors, all of your ancestors, regardless of where your families came from, lived in a time when some people believed other people could be owned as property. The Morrison family chose to risk everything to prove that belief was wrong. One student raised her hand. Were they ever caught? Maya smiled. Never, because they were careful, they were prepared, and they had community support from people who shared their values. The Underground Railroad succeeded because it was more than individual heroism. It was organized resistance based on moral principle. The tour concluded in the memorial chamber, where artifacts belonging to the freedom seekers themselves were displayed with the reverence due to people who had risked everything for liberty. Maya always ended here because she wanted visitors to understand that the Morrison family legacy was about service to something larger than themselves. My great-great-grandmother Sarah Morrison once wrote that God didn't put us on earth to be comfortable, Maya concluded. She believed we were here to do right by each other, especially when doing right was difficult. That's the lesson this place is meant to teach. After the students departed, Maya walked the familiar path to the farmhouse where Ruth was preparing lunch with the same methodical care she brought to all her tasks. But their relationship had evolved beyond the protective guardianship that had sustained Maya through her initial grief. They were partners now, co-stewards of a family legacy that had become a community treasure. Ruth's stories of the past provided historical context, while Maya's energy and vision shaped the preserve's educational mission. The combination had created something neither could have accomplished alone. Mrs. Patterson from the State Historical Commission called, Ruth reported as they sat down to eat. The federal designation came through. We're now officially part of the National Underground Railroad Network to freedom. Maya felt pride mixed with responsibility. Federal recognition brought resources and protection, but it also meant increased scrutiny and higher expectations for educational programming. Any word from the universities? Maya asked. Ruth smiled. 3 more requests for partnership agreements. Dr. Reeves has been telling colleagues that our approach to community-based historical interpretation could be a model for other sites. Maya appreciated the irony. The academic who had initially tried to claim ownership of their family legacy had become one of their strongest advocates, once he understood that the Morrison approach actually enhanced, rather than limited, scholarly access. Scout appeared at Maya's side, carrying the worn tennis ball that signaled his desire for their afternoon play session. But his attention remained partially focused on the preserve entrance, maintaining the vigilant guardianship that had protected the family's discovery from its earliest moments. Think he knows how important he is to all this? Ruth asked, scratching behind Scout's ears. Maya considered the question seriously. I think he knows he belongs here, that this is his job. Maybe that's all any of us really need to understand. As the afternoon light slanted across the Tennessee hills, Maya reflected on the journey that had brought her from isolated grief to purposeful service. Her parents' death had created a wound that would never completely heal, but discovering her family's legacy of courage had given that wound meaning. Sarah and Elijah Morrison had faced impossible choices and had chosen justice over safety. Ruth Morrison had preserved their story across generations of change and challenge. Now, Maya Morrison carried forward their commitment to providing sanctuary for people who needed it most. The preserve welcomed thousands of visitors each year, school groups learning about resistance and courage, families exploring their own connections to the Underground Railroad network, researchers studying the practical operation of freedom networks, and individuals seeking inspiration for their own struggles against injustice. But on quiet evenings, like this one, when the last tour group had departed and the hills settled into peaceful silence, Maya most appreciated the simple continuity of Morrison family stewardship. The same hills her ancestors had mapped now sheltered educational programs that taught their values to new generations. The same community bonds that had sustained the Underground Railroad network now supported a historical preserve that honored that legacy. Scout dropped his ball at Maya's feet, tail wagging with the optimism that had carried him through his own journey from abandonment to belonging. Maya threw the ball across the yard, watching him bound after it with undiminished enthusiasm. "Good boy," she called, meaning more than he could understand, but exactly what he needed to hear. The Morrison Family Underground Railroad Historical Preserve would continue its mission of education and inspiration, protected by the same community values and family dedication that had sustained it for more than 150 years. And Maya Morrison, junior curator and inheritor of extraordinary courage, would ensure that her ancestors' legacy of resistance continued to inspire others who faced their own impossible choices between safety and justice. The bronze plaque caught the last light of evening, its message gleaming like a promise across time. Some courage echoes through generations, and some discoveries change everything.